Mr. Chairman, Mr. Rector, ladies and gentlemen, students. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for the very nice introduction. It was a great pleasure and honor for me when your rector, Professor Jankov, asked me to address this academic audience on the occasion of the new economic school's commencement ceremony. He told me that I have to make a speech in English. And now I see that everything is in Russian here. And I would be pleased to have a chance one in 10 years to make a speech in Russian, so to refresh this language. I'm sorry, I didn't know it. I would do it with great pleasure. In the first 2 decades, glad to be here. When I listened to your chorus just now, I was surprised that I should probably. It came to my mind to weaken my statement, a good reputation, because I had a feeling that the students have to study permanently. Now I discovered that they are even able to sing and to do music, which is surprising. At a school where I would be the chairman, the students would never have a chance to do any singing in the evening, in the afternoon. So I have to think about it more. As I said, I'm really glad to be here, and I'm particularly glad to be here now when Russia is so disputed and, in my understanding, not fully correctly interpreted in the rest of the world. The commencement speech, as I understood, is connected with the name of Yegor Gaidar, who was certainly, not only in my eyes, one of the most distinguished Russian economists of the modern era, and one of the most democratic and liberal politicians. And was always impressed by his friendship and good-heartedness, by his sincerity, as well as by his sharp analytical thinking. There are, however, 2 moments which keep returning most often to my mind. The first one was our meeting in Prague, in my office in the Czechoslovak Ministry of Finance at the beginning of the 1990s. He wanted to hear my story, the story of my engagement in politics. I explained I didn't have higher ambitions than to be recognized as an economic expert. I was fired from the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences after the 1968 invasion into Czechoslovakia by Warsaw Pact armies, and for long 2 decades I was out of any academic university position. So I wanted just to return. That was my dream. Nevertheless, after becoming the first, as was mentioned, non-communist Minister of Finance, I understood very rapidly that in a democratic society, this role has no meaning without a strong political mandate, or at least a sufficient political support. When such support didn't exist, in my case, I decided to form my own political party. With this party, I succeeded in winning the parliamentary elections and became Prime Minister. I remember that Yegor Gaidar attentively listened. It seemed to me that he conceptually agreed, but hesitated. He was not sure the same story could work in Russia. So that was my first interesting and important meeting. The second, I will also never forget his very clever answer to a hostile and aggressive question at a conference in Warsaw, organized to celebrate 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. He was attacked, not just academically criticized, for the imperfections and inconsistencies of Russian reforms there at that conference. He didn't try to make excuses and didn't start repeating his just finished, quite sophisticated lecture devoted to the same issue. He said, "I was only Prime Minister of Russia. I was not Tsar of Russia." This was a very good, very clever point for those who wanted to understand. All true reformers know the many constraints they had to face and are aware of the very limited power they have, I stress, in a non-totalitarian society. We all miss him. He was a very good economist belonging to the older but good and unjustly abandoned tradition of political economy. He learned it in the communist era and became an example of the fact which the now dominant, oversimplified and over-trivialized interpretation of the communist era makes almost impossible to comprehend. He proved that it was possible to study economic science even then, and that there is no excuse for those who didn't do it and keep saying that it was not possible. Some of us, and Jegor Gajdar belonged to that group, were convinced that we were obliged to use even the tragic years of communism in the best possible and productive way. That we should try to maximize our own personal, of course, only implicit utility function, given the existing non-trivial constraints. The external ones, based on the oppressivity of the communist regime, and the internal ones, formed by our own beliefs, convictions, morals, and preferences. I tried to discuss these issues in a book I wrote 5 years ago on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the fall of communism in my country. It was published in Czech with the title Kde začíná zítřek, where tomorrow starts. It exists also in Russian language, Kde начинается будущее, published by the Художественная литература publishing house. I feel very strongly that we still owe the people in our countries, and especially the future generations, an appropriate, non-trivialized description and a truly scientific analysis of the oppressiveness, irrationality, and inefficiency of the communist regime. We should take it as our task for the future. Without it, a proper understanding of the post-communist era is impossible. The years of communism were lost years, but not useless or empty years. Some of us tried to build our own human capital, a term I hope you were taught during your studies here, in the way it was innovatively used by my good friend, recently deceased Professor Gary Becker, whom we all miss very much. Jegor Gajdar built his own human capital, and due to it, he happened to be prepared to play the role he was chosen to play in Russia in the early 1990s. His life is also a proof of the importance of economic theory, of its practicability, of its productive applicability in the real world. I take this fact as a positive and promising message for those who study or just completed studying economics. I firmly hope there are future Jegor Gajdars sitting somewhere in this audience. Let me use this very unique opportunity to discuss some of Jegor Gajdar's topics. My comments can be divided into three groupings. First, the economists turned politicians in the moment of the fall of communism in Central and East European countries knew that they had to attempt changing the whole economic, political and social system. They wanted to accomplish a fundamental and total systemic change. Some of them understood quite well that partial, piecemeal reforms will not do. Some of them realized that they had to put together a critical mass of steps, measures, changes at one moment for two main reasons. Knowing that the changes will not be painless and costless, however necessary and inevitable they were, the reformers had to convince the people that they were serious, that their ambition was to make a substantial change, that they did not maximize the number of years in office by making only superficial, easy changes. And they wanted to achieve a real change against all the attempts of status quo defenders and against powerful inertia of institutions and of people's behavior. Not all of us succeeded in this respect, and in spite of my very limited knowledge of the Russian reality, I dare say that Jegor Gajdar made a fundamental breakthrough. There are several other names of his colleagues who deserve to be mentioned, but his is the most important one. Second, the second precondition to succeed in economic transformation was the ability to put all the necessary ingredients together without omitting, for the lack of knowledge or competence or lack of political power, some of them. I want to be well understood. I don't speak about perfection, about a 5,000 pages long ex-ante prepared blueprint of comprehensive reforms implemented eventually after years of preparation and facing the growing impatience of suddenly free people. I also don't speak about the would-be merciful, friendly to anyone, Joseph Stiglitz-style gradualism, which is a phony and deceitful nickname for doing nothing. I speak about a practical, meaningful, flexible, adaptable, realistic project. It is difficult to put together all the ingredients in theory, because we deal with a multidimensional system and with real people, not with pawns in a chess game. And it is, of course, much more difficult to do it in reality. Before the fall of communism, people like me and Jegor Gajdar studied all kinds of theories about the so-called optimal sequencing of reform measures. My experience tells me, and I understood it very rapidly, that anything like optimal sequencing is possible only in textbooks, not in reality. Detailed masterminding and fine-tuning of systemic changes is impossible. Some elementary rules, however, do exist and should be followed. I would include among them the following ones. first. I already mentioned the importance of a critical mass of reform measures to be done at the very beginning. Second, it is not less necessary to achieve an elementary macroeconomic equilibrium in order to avoid the destructive effects of high inflation. In my country, we definitely had the incomparably lowest inflation from among all the post-communist countries. We are probably the only country where not the savings of the population were not destroyed by inflation. Third, price liberalization, which is connected with that, should be done only with a reasonable degree of macro stability to avoid vicious circles of price spirals. It's a mistake to liberalize prices and foreign trade in different moments. Something else is the liberalization of the capital account of balance of payments. As was mentioned by your chairman, transformation process has no meaning without early privatization. It must be widespread, it must be fast, to shorten the pre-privatization limbo. It must be done without waiting for the much-needed restructuring of firms, and it must be done without waiting for the emergence of domestic capital. As was mentioned, the non-standard concepts as voucher privatization in our case are therefore inevitable. And the institutional framework of the market economy is an important contribution to the success of reforms. But the institutional building is an endless task. It is impossible to wait for perfect institutions. It would be wrong to stop deregulation, liberalization, desubsidization, privatization, and other reform measures waiting for the arrival of fully developed institutions. My more comprehensive discussion of these issues is to be found in my contribution to the Transition Perspective project prepared by the Peterson Institute for International Economics, in which your rector, Professor Djankov, has been very, very active. The book with papers prepared by well-known reformers from the 1990s will be published in the autumn, I suppose. The third precondition for the success of transition was the ability to explain it, including its inevitable costs, to the people. They have to believe in the transformation process. They have to become co-players. They have to give it elementary political support. This was probably the most difficult task, and I guess Jegor Gajdar would agree with this statement of mine. It was 20, in our case, already almost 25 years ago. We have different tasks and face different challenges now. The individual post-communist countries have, for many subjective and objective reasons, reached varying levels of maturity of their economic and political developments. I don't intend to mark them. Some of these countries are normal market economies and political democracies already. Normal in European sense, which means they are very far from free markets and full-fledged parliamentary democracies. Nevertheless, these countries have the transformation task behind them already. Some other countries are still on the way, on the road, to put it that way, to achieve this status. According to my reading of the reality, Russia belongs to this grouping. I have no recommendations what should be done here now, and I have no ambitions to do it. That would be a totally different topic, next year's graduation ceremony. And in addition to it, I am very cautious, if not hostile, to the would-be well-meant advices from abroad. I don't like the very profitable branch of industry called consulting. The experience tells me that the marginal effect of it is asymptotically close to zero. Well, I suppose that you studied in new economic schools and you are supposed to be the consultant, so I'm surprised that you are applauding these statements. It's against your private interests. You are not maximizing your future flow of income. I'm sorry to be happy with that statement. As I said, some countries are still on the way, on the road to achieve this status. Some of these countries have not complemented the whole process. Some made the institutional transition, but the markets, political and economic ones, are still shallow and therefore inefficient. Institutions remain weak and malfunctioning. Property rights are still questioned and unsecure. That can be changed only by evolution. There is no rapid effect medicine which could solve this immaturity. To discuss these issues would go beyond the limits of this ceremonial lecture. I came to Russia from Central Europe, from Prague, from a country which has very early more or less solved the transformation puzzle, from a country which is a part of the European Union, of this, in the eyes of its acolytes and worshippers, future, if not already today's, paradise on earth. I see it differently. I see its inefficient, extensively paternalistic, by environmentalism burdened economic system which makes healthy economic growth impossible. I see its already long time lasting sovereign debt crisis which was brought about by the unfortunate, only politically motivated euro, common currency, experiment by this revolutionary attempt to stop history. It reminds me of the past. The communists also wanted to eliminate the validity of economic laws and wanted to politically mastermind the economy. It did not work. And I see also the EU post-democratic political arrangements based on the suppression of nation states, which represent the only entity where democracy is possible, not at a continental level. To summarize, the substance of my polemics with current European arrangements is based on the criticism both of the negative effects of the ambitions to economically centralize and unify the European continent, and of the underestimation of negative consequences of the undemocratic suppression of nation states in favor of pan-European governance. The economic stagnation Europe is facing is not a historic inevitability. It's a man-made problem. It is an outcome of a deliberately chosen and for years and decades gradually developed European economic and social system, on the one hand, and of the more and more centralistic and undemocratic European Union political, institutional arrangements on the other. They both, and especially they together, form an unsurmountable obstacle to any further positive development. What we go through is not an accident or a misfortune. It is a self-inflicted problem. It's a self-inflicted injury. Hundreds of small, at first sight, innocent details have metamorphosed into a serious economic problem. Not less important is the fact that the excessive and unnatural centralization, bureaucratization, harmonization, standardization, and unification of the European continent has created a deep, more and more visible democratic defect, not just a democratic deficit, as it is euphemistically called. The end result of this is that we can't speak of democracy in Europe anymore. We entered a post-democratic or semi-democratic era, which was, of course, always a dream of socialists of all colors. This may become, in the long run, an even bigger problem than the current economic stagnation. I mentioned euro, single currency, and the European Monetary Union. European Monetary Union is nothing else than an extreme version of a fixed exchange rate system. As an economist, I have to argue that all historically known fixed exchange rate regimes needed exchange rates realignments sooner or later. It's an elementary textbook knowledge. Eliminating this powerful and for centuries functioning adjustment mechanism was a naive attempt to stop history, something which all the constructivists, central planners, manipulators and dictators always wanted to achieve, unfortunately. So my European experience is another reason for my reluctance to give any recommendations here today. I am convinced that I should concentrate on giving recommendations there where I live. Thank you. Thank you for your attention. And once again, thank you for giving me the honor of being here with you today. Thank you very much. You can come here. You can come here and use this one.
А вот микрофон заработал, наверное, теперь и вопросы появятся.
Mr. President, what, in your opinion, the key factor of success of reforms in your country? The key one, macroeconomic stability, or I don't know, political support, something else? The key one. What do you think?
What was the key part of that I didn't understand the first sentence. Well, I think it's not possible to pick up just one issue, but definitely we understood that we have to start immediately, radically, and to make visible radical changes. That's to start liberalizing, deregulating the economy immediately. Second, I happen to be the Minister of Finance, so I prepared the first state budget in order to eliminate or to lower, to make smaller the macroeconomic disequilibrium, I came with the first state budget, which was a surplus budget. It's probably unique in the history of our countries to have the first post-communist budget as a surplus budget, but that was the only way how to minimize the macroeconomic disequilibrium. So it helped very much. Then we started a radical privatization program, and by introducing the so-called coupon privatization or voucher privatization, we succeeded in getting the support of the people of the country. And I remember that was the main issue we discussed with Jegor Gaidar once, and he always tried to tell me that I always stress that we must know where to go. We must know how to get there, and we must be able to explain it to the people of the country to get sufficient support. And Jegor Gaidar told me, I think we have the same knowledge of economics, so I think the first and second part is identical in our case. I'm not sure, but basically I agree. But the third problem is much bigger in a big Russia than in small Czechoslovakia, which probably is to some respect true.
Пожалуйста, еще вопросы, можно на русском.
I've got the question about the reforms as well. The question is about the reforms as well. You've just said that the reforms should be made immediately, but the example of China shows that the Chinese government thinks that the major principle of the reforms is gradualism, meaning that the reforms should be made in a way like step by step, getting to the aim. Why do you think they are not right, or what's your opinion on that?
Well, I think that the answer is very, very simple and very easy. The gradual reforms, step-by-step reforms, partial reforms can be done only in an undemocratic setting, political setting, in a truly democratic situation where the political change is done immediately after the fall of communism. It is absolutely impossible to start gradually making the changes. It can be done only in such a country as China today. Russia, you know definitely much better, Well, the fact that some reforms are not complete and not full and not fully organized, I would not call that gradualism. This is just wrong reforms.
Пожалуйста, еще вопросы. Да, пожалуйста.
Thank you for your lecture, Mr. Klaus. Well, it is often said that it is often said that one of the mistakes of Jegor Gaidar and his team was that they didn't pay a lot of attention to promoting the reforms and explaining the ideas. But still there is a fact that we know that they said that after Soviet propaganda, they didn't want to use these methods to be a lot on TV, yes, to abuse people with this information. And that led to the thing that a lot of people in the country, they didn't understand the logics of market reforms and the basic of economics. How did you solve this problem? How did you explain what you wanted?
First, I don't blame the people in my country, your country, or elsewhere for not understanding the reforms. The people I genuine homo economicus. In the first moment, they are free to behave freely. So I don't think that the people must be first 10, 20, 30 years executed by all the Chicago school economists, and then they are finally finally able to understand the economic reforms. No. I am convinced that the people understand the substance of the market economy much more than standard intellectuals and politicians in any country, including yours country. So don't blame the people for that. That's for me a crucial and substantial issue. I didn't blame Gaidar for not explaining it sufficiently. I accept that they did not succeed in explaining the reforms. That's a different story. I don't know whether they did their best to do it. I remember my good friend and well-known reformer who was once at your commencement ceremony, Leszek Balcerowicz, the Russian, immediately lost all his political positions a year and a half after the reform. And I remember we discussed in Prague in my office, and I tried to tell him my trio, where to go, how to get there, and to explain it to the people. And I told him, I go every day to make a speech on a main square of one town, city, small village or another, every day. And I remember Leszek Balcerowicz told me, well, I prefer sitting in my office and writing something, That's a fundamental difference. I don't know whether Yegor Gaidar was closer to me or to Leszek Balcerowicz, but when we discussed it, he told me it's easy to go by car almost from one part of Czechoslovakia to another. In Russia, I am dependent fully on the official TV, and I don't have enough space for explaining it. That was our debate with him. I would blame the Russian reformers much more for not paying sufficient attention to the macroeconomic situation. I know that they didn't have in their hands the printing press and the central bank with Mr. Gerashchenko and so on, but we succeeded in having very cautious monetary policy and a fiscal policy with a surplus budget. So that totally changed the atmosphere in the country, which, as I know, was not the case of Russia. So that's the main difference. In our country, the rate of inflation was only once, probably, or twice with the value-added tax reform. It was the second case. Only once the rate of inflation was in two-digit rate of inflation. In all other years, it was a one-digit rate of inflation. And I know something about your rate of inflation, which is was a little bit higher. Not much, but a little bit.
That's very kind of you. It was much higher. Да, пожалуйста.
Konstantin Kurbatov, MIF 2015. Mr. President, how do you think the size of economy affect on the speed of reform or even for possibility of reforms? Thank you.
So the size of the economy. Well, I have here one collaborator from the Czech embassy here in Moscow, and we discussed it yesterday in the evening during the dinner, and he made a very good point, which I have never used in all my speeches. And he said, we discussed the size, and he said, Russia's economy is as the big tanker, oil tanker, and as we all know, to turn the tanker is much different than to turn a small boat. So Mr. Kroužek should stand up. You are the author of that statement, so I'm quoting you explicitly. And I think it may be a good point, which it's definitely easier for me to discuss. We didn't have your style of perestroika with such a disequilibrium in everything in the economy. So it was in this respect also easier in our country to do it.
Да, Да, пожалуйста.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your lecture, Mr. Klaus. I'm totally persuaded that human rights and economic reforms should go hand in hand. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm sure that you cannot promote entrepreneurship without rule of law. You cannot expect people to work harder for their own prosperity without seeing the transparency of the government or the accountability of the authorities. So how do you have any advices, or first, do you agree with me? And second, do you have any advices how to make and to promote both economic reforms and political democratization changes? Thank you.
Well, I wouldn't speak about human rights. I would speak about civic rights. This is a total difference. I am not in favor of human rightism, which is, in my understanding, one of the dangerous isms of the current era. Freedom, liberty, civic rights, that's absolutely crucial. Human rights, mostly defined as positive, not negative rights, is something I don't subscribe to, I'm sorry to say. Freedom, political freedom, to liberalize. I think that the crucial condition was to liberalize, in our case, to liberalize the entry into the political market. As economists, you know what it means to liberalize the entry into the energy markets. The same precondition for success was to liberalize the entry into the political market. We did it, and in an organized elections 6 months after the fall of communism, and immediately in 3 months' time, 46 political parties were overnight created. Most of them disappeared very soon. Nevertheless, to liberalize the entry into the political market is the precondition for fundamental changes in any country. The politicians then have a task to prepare all the legislation, all the institutions of society which makes the rule of law possible. But that's the sequencing of issues. True political liberalization. Whether it exists here or not is not my task to judge.
Пожалуйста.
Hello, Mr. President. Good evening. My name is Garnik from Skolkovo. I have one question about Eurozone and Czech Republic. So as we all know several years ago, Czech Republic didn't step in Eurozone. And what do you think in the future? How do you see Czech Republic in the future, with monetary union or without? As we know that it was the right decision not to step in, because it makes more flexible the country with its monetary policy, to be more flexible to react on the crisis, and etc., etc. And how do you see in the future, Czech Republic? Thank you.
How I see the future. That one thing is my forecasting, and another thing is my wish. I consider the creation of the European signal currency as a tragic mistake. What is going on there? I don't blame Greece or Portugal or any other country. Countries like Greece and Portugal and Spain are the victims of a system, not the other way around. They didn't spoil the system. It's absolutely crazy in a heterogeneous economic entity called Europe, or create to try to homogenize the economic parameters by introducing single currency. That's not the way how to do it, and the single currency created the current mistakes. About the future, I don't know. I remember in the 20 years ago, I was asked very often, it was still before the single currency, I was asked whether the Czech Republic wants to join the euro. And well, I said, well, it's not the issue now, maybe sometimes in the future. And when I wanted to provoke an audience 20 years ago in Western Europe somewhere, my answer, well, I maybe sometimes in the future, and we will pick up some interesting historical date, some interesting historical anniversary. And I was thinking that I make a good joke by saying, what about doing it in 2017 in the 100 years anniversary of the October Revolution here in Russia, you know. And I had the feeling that it was a good joke, you know. Now we have 2014 and I think I was wrong. We will definitely not enter the Eurozone in the year 2017. I don't know. We were forced when we entered the European Union just 10 years ago on the 1st of May 2004. We were forced to sign that we will join the euro, but it didn't bother us before because there was no necessity to say when. So we had a feeling that we will decide eventually to do it. Well, I remember in 2009, maybe 2009, 2010, Angela Merkel came to my office, to the Prague Castle, and off the record she asked me, do you think, she knows perfectly all my arguments against the euro, and she said, do you think that in the year 2015 you will be members of the Eurozone? And I immediately reacted, Angela, do you really think that in the year 2015 the euro will still exist? She was not very happy with that answer of mine. Nevertheless, well, I really don't know. I think it's a tragic mistake, and it would be victory for some countries in Europe to be allowed to go unpunished and in an organized way to go out of the Eurozone, because that would be the only way how to make the future economic life of countries like Greece possible. Being in the straitjacket of the Eurozone for those countries is no future, no possibility in the future. And I always argue that we divided Czechoslovakia into two parts, 22 years ago, and more or less I did it. And we wanted to first to keep the Czechoslovak crown as a common currency, because we wanted to keep the customs union, we did. We wanted to keep the free trade zone, and we had a feeling that we could keep the Czechoslovak crown. We discovered after 6 or 7 weeks that it's impossible. So I can tell you that to divide a country, to divide a currency is a relatively, administratively, organizationally, it's an easy task. So I always suggest to the Brussels politicians that I am prepared to volunteer to do it with the euro in Europe.
One last question. Последний вопрос.
It's kind of going back a bit. President Klaus, so speaking of, when you're comparing reforms in Czechoslovakia and Russia, it seems to me that, Czechoslovakia was just going back to where they were in 1940, and the whole society, in a sense, had still the memory of how it should work. Supposed to, obviously, to Russia, where it had to find its own way, and to even open the political space to new parties, and everything has to be invented. So So the time frame had to be absolutely different. It's just hard to imagine it could be the same time frame.
Definitely, I agree. My parents still remember the political regime in the 1930s, so that was definitely a difference. Nevertheless, we also had more than 40 years of communism, and 2 generations were already without any touch with free markets and with political parliamentary democracy and pluralism. So definitely it was easier for us, and I would never dare to compare and criticize our possibilities, chances, reforms. No, that's not my ambition. Plus, I have to say that in the 1990s I was sufficiently busy with our own changes in the country, so I didn't follow day by day the situation in Russia, so I don't pretend to have a special detailed knowledge of the Russian developments.
Большое спасибо.